Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie with Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Laura Kolbe launching her new book, Little Pharma. She'll be talking with Jordan Kisner and Isabel Duarte-Gray, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Laura, Jordan, Isabel, and the team at University of Pittsburgh Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Although we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. There's just a few housekeeping things to go over before we get started tonight. In our Zoom webinar, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways that you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the authors and to interact with fellow attendees. But if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that in the Q&A module, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting your questions there and not in the chat. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Little Pharma, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. at both our Fulton Street and Flatbush Ave stores, where you can purchase Laura's book and many others on site. You can also order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll be dropping the buy link in the chat in just a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. In conversation with our featured author tonight are Jordan Kisner and Isabel Duarte-Gray. Isabel Duarte-Gray was born in Oakland, California, and raised in a trailer in Catawba, Kentucky. She is currently a PhD candidate at Harvard University, where she studies Latinx literature, poetry, and eco-criticism. She received her BA in English and Russian from Amherst College. Her poems have appeared in or are forthcoming in the Colorado Review, That City Review, the South Carolina Review, and December Magazine, among others. Jordan Kisner is the author of the essay collection Thin Places, named one of the best books of 2020 by NPR. She is a contributing writer for The Atlantic, a columnist for the Paris Review, and her work appears in the New York Times Magazine, The Believer, M+1, Pitchfork, and others. She is also the creator of the LitHub podcast Thresholds. She is currently a 2020-2021 fellow at the Black Mountain Institute. She teaches creative writing at Columbia University. They will be speaking with our featured author, Laura Kolbe. Laura is a doctor and medical ethicist at New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center. She studied English and American literature at Harvard and the University of Cambridge. Her work has been anthologized in A World Out of Reach. She lives in Brooklyn with her partner, Andrew, and their dog, Bonnie. Laura's new book, Little Pharma, is a Dantean journey from the depths of an institution and of a pervading personal dread to a renewed celebration of human contact, the body, and the giddy, terrifying excitement of ongoing life. Laura is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Jordan and Isabel and with all of you. Please take it away, Laura.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for coming tonight, and in particular, Isabel and Jordan. It's really, really kind of you to donate your intelligence and your wit to tonight's conversations. I'm really looking forward to it. And I love your books as well, so I'm so glad that our books get to talk to each other too. So I thought I'd read just a few poems from the book to give a taste of the arc of it. And I'm going to start with one that's in the form of an abecedary, which is any poem or piece of text that uses the letters of the alphabet as kind of a constraining form, you know, sort of like A is for apple, B is for bird. But this one is an abecedary about ICUs. It's called Buried Abecedary for Intensive Care. It's called an awakening trial when the pleasanter drugs stop. It's called bucking when the lungs and vent jam wind against each other. It's called clubbing when the fingernails thicken to spoons from lack of oxygen. It's called drug fever when no one knows why. It's called elevation when the eyes can see where the feet should be. It's called fasting when radiology foretells like a speaking goat on the blue blood mountain. It's called gunk when they suction the trach. It's called HIPAA when no one tells. It's called inspiration just before the triggered cough. It's called jaw thrust when the head is prepared for the Macintosh blade. It's called kin when they don't shy speechless from the gunk, and when they do. It's called labored when breath outmoans machines. It's called manual blood pressure when you hope the machine lied. It's called nitroprusside when the body is flushed like a cinema. It's called octreotide when the blood untucks the napkin of the diner. It's called a pan scan when the body won't tell. It's called a query when insurer and the bank won't tell. Called resuscitation, but it isn't. Called shock when it started as resuscitation. Called Trendelenburg when the feet are in the air. Called underventilation when the gas is more like the future planets. Called the vagus nerve when touching the neck makes the rhythm stop. Called weaning when the fentanyl hangs salivary at the chin of the bed. Called zeroform when the gauze smells like gin and tonic. Called you when it's a question of error. Called zeroing out when they reset the machines for the next body. So in some ways, that's probably the most anti-lyric poem in the whole collection, but gives a sense, I hope, of the foreignness and the kind of crossing over to the kingdom of the sick, or the kind of surrealism of clinical spaces. And I have a suite of poems in the book that are all kind of persona poems within the hospital that helped me, I think, explore kind of alternative affects, villainy, guilt, shame, other things that are kind of not presentable within the context of clinical life, but can be sort of explored in the multiverse of a poetry collection. And one of these persona poems is called Little Pharma as Lady Macbeth. Everything turned out to be true. The ward rooms had thick wooden doors and sealed picture windows. Given a room with one man screaming, you could throw medicine and close the door. Given a room of two men, one screaming, you kept the door open for sake of the quiet one. The doors were like children's scabs needing to be coaxed along. In the pharmacy of the child, one used a hopscotch stone, a jacket zipper, one's tongue, the sharper tongue of a friend, anything to get one's soft skin back. The doors were like the lost world of loose teeth, of which there seemed to be hundreds per mouth, needing special prayers, offerings of ribbons and hot caramels, barely singed meats, whatever would lure them, trading pain for money. Through the door, you could shuttle white, pink, slate pills, vials of lidocaine applied by needle, patches of fentanyl, their rate-limiting membrane, like the flower called 4 o'clocks, flickering between trumpet and fist. Blue, gray, ochre pills for our guests. It was our success to offer so much variety and yet consistency, as bathed the old courts and hotels, ichor of silver polish and mineral oil, forms of silence opening, porches of cadenza, patio fermatas. One could teach well-born children how to attack the phrase. The guests already know. And I'll just read one more before we launch into some conversation and some of Isabel and Jordan's work as well. This one is called The Countable, and it takes as its starting point the lines in the gospel about the idea of God being someone who would be aware of, even the fall of the sparrow, even every lily in the field, and have this absolute sense of the particular, and thinking about that as in relation to the consciousness of doctors who also want to be, aware of each particular and each being with whom they come in contact, but that being a kind of impossible and too divine task. The countable. To be among the countable, be scant as bird in air. Oily mutter of unreaping wing is enough. Dropping seeds that plants may dumbly grow is enough. Slamming glass, shiner to shine, when your bill hits porch window, your phantom rival flared up and gone. Sorehead, be master of thump and ding. That is enough to be counted in books of the living. May be saved by a nut brown hand, suet buffed, brought to a bosom of happy enumeration. I was doing my best at the breakfast table with boxed cornflakes and the last slug of milk when the first bird dropped, heavy as a child's trophy, its ember soaking air from my yard. It seemed my job to take note, its glass-hued wing, its sacral rage, in case I was the Count's one deputy that day. What a god of suffering. I pulled the shade. I was ringing laps in a Sunday night grocery, everything smudged in the old week's rouge, soft in my belly as an oyster making love. It seemed no one could note as I did the dusty pecking of a man at the free cheese tray, how he studied the prices of capicola, took 4 toothpicks of Swiss, swizzled his brow, took 7 more. Of course, I only watched, with no idea which of Knight's tollmen charged him on the cold walk home. Of course there is a count. Of course there is a shining booth where tickets are redeemed for fuzzy things, or simply someone holds your hand under a butter moon, tells you of your 5 fingers, whispers that even a 6th would be beautiful on you. Even a hand known to claw after gimcracks, beautiful. The toothpicks trailed him like frost at the edge of a department store fire, wholly white and still, while his ground floor of perfumes wrapped hoods of burnt sugar on the speechless. If I cotton to an ultimate mercy, it is one of 2-ply robes and hammered velvet, the kingfisher humming Tallis to the sunset, sure, but also many thin clerks and reeves, nervous to exist, an attic of abacuses dozing in crackalore, a little behind time in their contributions flocked with eraser tongues. If I fall after you, it is because of the baked Alaska in my chest, which wants to be a tower of alternating pains snugged in cloud, but is running from an unplanned heat, its several colors streaming from the base. Count them. Before they mix to gray-brown, they are yours. Thanks.
Laura, thank you. That was so exciting to listen to and so beautiful. I have been nominated to get our conversation started after the reading, which now feels like such a hard task because I want to just like sort of lie down and marinate in what you just read. But I'll do my best. Thank you for having us. Something I was thinking about when I was reading this collection, and it came up again as I was listening to you read now, is the extent to which these poems feel like they are doing the work, not just of poetry, but also of teaching the reader, inviting the reader into a world and teaching the reader about a world that is, to most of us, foreign or unknown. I feel like we can really, especially in the 3 poems you read, notice that in the abecedary, the first one you read, where we're getting so much poetic language, but like the poem is also orienting us linguistically and kind of philosophically into a new world. And I wanted to ask how you thought about that as like the poet writing to an audience that you knew might be largely people who didn't understand the world of medicine, the world of Little Pharma.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. I think a broad way to answer it would be that, all 3 of us as artists and all of the artists and writers in the audience tonight, I think part of the work that you do as you cultivate your particular art and your voice is that while you're simultaneously making your work, you're also kind of teaching the reader how to read you, teaching what is this particular language or dialect that you are inventing in your corpus of work. So I think that that's true and that's general, and that's kind of an interesting thing to think about as each of us are kind of moving through our early careers, and what's the kind of pedagogical project that we're doing in kind of inventing a language and teaching it simultaneously along the way. But more specifically for medicine, I think it came from a sort of anti-authoritarian impulse where, I do love the idea of conceiving of the book as a map or a guidebook to the world of medicine, of care for the sick body, but I don't necessarily want to make the claim for it that it's a trustworthy one. And I think that the book tries to be candid about my own disorientation in a lot of these spaces, and my own lostness. So I think it's sort of a case of not the blind leading the blind, but someone who is sort of a misbegotten guide being assigned to be, a cicerone where they've no business, necessarily, I don't know. I think that the trails that I'm blazing are not necessarily kind of the correct ones, but hopefully there's a kind of companionable sense for the reader that we can sort of be lost and a little bit alienated and at sea together.
I mean, I couldn't help but be struck when I was reading your collection by how the words have this like bodily quality to them, where each word, when you handle it, you'll pick an obscure or strange word and then place it next to a mundane experience. And I remember thinking, like, this is a vocabulary that isn't often used in poetry. And then I thought about it and realized there's a huge tradition of doctors appearing in poetry, or of doctors writing poetry, doctors writing work. But they rarely approach it from the point of view that you do. So there's Anton Chekhov, for example, but there's also Rafael Campo, but William Carlos Williams was a doctor poet. But the person I keep thinking of with you in particular is John Keats, who was also trained as a doctor. And I wanted to ask, the reason I draw the comparison is, even though he is not making abecedaries about medical technology, he is giving us a way to hold words as this kind of mystic experience. And I wanted to ask how things like romantic irony, the idea that on the one hand, you're trying to prevent death, and on the other hand, you write in the face of the inevitability thereof. Like, how do those experiences inform your poetry?
Yeah, I think all of the doctor writers that you mentioned do a tremendous job, whatever formal techniques they're using, of being able to entertain on the page a sense of inadequacy, a sense of the kind of just the odd ratio of the tininess of oneself next to the kind of sublimity of all that is in the body or in the kind of human life cycle, and a kind of gentle self-deprecation that I think, and particularly in Bulgakov's memoirs about being a doctor, or in William's stories and poems about it. And for Keats, I mean, you're right, he didn't really write about clinical practice. In fact, I don't think he ever practiced beyond sort of training and study. But, I think for him, it's such a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's so alive, I think, for many of us. But the concept of negative capability, the concept of being able to dwell in a vast set of uncertainties and to give them each their due and kind of manifest that polyphony of possibility on the page, is his greatest gift, just to doctors in general, full stop. But I think particularly for the doctor poet, that trying not to close down on certainty too early, too soon, is something that I try to keep at the forefront of my practice, both when I see patients, but also when I'm working at the page as well. And I think I know that this manifests in different ways for both of you too, even though you have different genres, Jordan, and different subject matter, Isabel. But Jordan, I think one of the things that you render so beautifully in Thin Places is how many different vocations that to the external observer appear to be certain bodies of knowledge are actually very much like processes of trial and error. And I think of the deep brain stimulation that you write about in the title essay, and about how one might imagine that is sort of a formulaic science, kind of a deployment of perfect technique and knowledge. And actually, it's very much kind of like fishing around. And I wonder, when you were kind of reporting on that and then turning it into this beautiful braided essay, whether you thought about that overtly as kind of a metaphor for your own craft. If you want to talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. I felt like that. I was so horrified to learn that this piece of neurosurgery that they're like inserting electrodes deep into the brain, and they don't totally know the spot that they're looking for. A bit of like quick context is that this essay that Laura was referring to, this is the title essay of my book, has as a piece of it this research into, the essay is about obsessive compulsive disorder and sort of theories thereof and methods of treatments, and how it has influenced my thinking about illness and wellness and the self. And I got really fascinated with this experimental neurosurgery. It was more experimental at the time than it is now, called deep brain stimulation. And they're basically inserting a pacemaker. Laura, correct me. I'm sure I'm going to say things that are wrong here, but they're functionally like inserting a pacemaker into a deep part of the brain that is kind of like responsible for fear responses and pleasure responses, and big core human things. And I had been horrified to sort of discover that like they have to have the patient be awake, because they don't really know the spot they're looking for. The patient has to be awake to report what it is like to all of a sudden have stimulation here in the brain versus here in the brain versus here in the brain. And what's kind of miraculous about it is that the symptoms can be affected so quickly. It can be this like sort of world change really quickly once they get the right, the electrode in the right place, but they don't know what they're looking for. And that definitely felt, to your question, Laura, like that really felt like part of the process of, always the process of writing. I never know what I'm what I'm kind of like striking for when I'm sitting down to write, which feels both exciting and scary, but also felt to me like the work of that particular essay, which was trying to kind of reframe some of the stories that I had been told as a person with an obsessive compulsive disorder, because I had this sense, having having sort of grown, like that those stories weren't working anymore. And so I was kind of trying to like write my way to a different understanding of an experience that I'd had as a young person. And so it did feel like that kind of like fishing quality. And it was terrifying in the way that you think like, God, you want the brain surgeons to really know where they're going. And like, I want, as a writer, especially when you're writing about something that has high stakes, like you want, or for you, you're like trying to figure something out that's important to your life. You want to know that it's going to be fine, and you don't. And it's coming back to this like negative capability that Keats gave us, of writing as this act of sort of blind trust, that working without assurance that you're going to get where you're supposed to go.
Yeah.
Isabel, is that an experience I feel like that's like a lot of writers have that experience, but I don't know, maybe that's not your experience.
Oh no, I certainly, I was just thinking that, that Laura, your epigraph is kind of interestingly attuned to this question, because you have several epigraphs, but the one that caught me, because I was just shocked to read it there, was, "Do not adopt the ways of sorcerers, for they are all not," and then they are nothing, demons, spirits of the dead, and therefore they can't, how are the dead supposed to reanimate the dead or the living or cure anything? And I remember thinking, like, there's this way that the sort of search for something like truth, or something like a kind of thin place between the living and the dead and the unborn and the born, is this process of trying to figure out what is most necessary in any given moment of living. and what we need to continue surviving. And I wanted to ask, like, both of you, and one of you writes prose and the other writes poetry, and I would say, as a poet myself, that the oath, the poet Hippocratic oath, does not really require a degree of honesty or accuracy. Like my book is full of lies, like just full of lies. That's why I don't belong in the Republic. But I wanted to know, like, how do the logics of these two discourses, medicine and poetry, but also the sort of truth factor, fit into that search for a truth or an accuracy or an honesty? I mean, at another point in your book, you literally say, you talk about a dissecting blade, and I could not help but see that as ars poetic, of like, is poetry a blade? How does it work? How does it fit into this? On the one hand, it's almost like the work of sorcery. And on the other hand, it is a tool. I mean, you call it a holy thing. So where's the sacred and the profane existing in the use of language for you, both of you?
Yeah, that's, wow. There's so many great ideas there. I would start by saying that, yeah, so some of the epigraphs in the book are from kind of alternative oaths in other cultures, other traditions that doctors or healthcare workers might take for embarking on their work. And one thing I noticed in kind of looking at like a little bit of cross-cultural survey about these various oaths is one that, like, we feel like we need to do something, we need to make a vow, we need to do some kind of speech act that initiates us to this rite. And so it's interesting that, like, the process of entering the persona of the clinician itself involves kind of an incantation or a kind of spell casting, but also that one common thread is about this, like, do not overstep, do not become something more than what we've trained you to be. We've trained you to be a doctor, stick to that. Don't try to play God, don't get into witchcraft, like don't spill over beyond yourself. And I feel quite ambivalent about that. I mean, I feel like it's totally appropriate, obviously, for my work as a doctor and non-sorcerer. But I think when I'm a poet, like, the whole game is about overbrimming, about too muchness, about going for broke. And sometimes that doesn't wind up in the final draft, but, like, you really can't get started if you have this sort of, like, oathy voice in your head that's like, don't go too far, don't be too crazy, like, don't kind of extend this theater, don't break the fourth wall, like, keep it together, keep it constrained and professional. So I wrestle with that tension as I kind of code switch between these two different parts of my life and think about, like, how on earth can I synthesize the two? And so I don't have a great answer for that, but that's definitely the tension that's there, which I guess is sort of the black magic of that you're referring to. But yeah, I don't know, Jordan, how you think about sort of boundaries and boundedness when you're making your own work.
I mean, yeah, it's such a beautiful and huge question. Isabel, you sort of like invoked the notion of the truth, which like, presumably as a nonfiction writer, you have made some pact with your reader that what you are writing is true in some way, or factual in some way, or verifiable in some way. And yet so much of human experience, even if you're writing exactly what you experienced in any given time, is so subjective and so fluid and so changing, that it always feels like a little bit of a tightrope walk between, like, the duty to be not fabricating, right, and also the desire to evoke something that feels. Sometimes there's a tension between what feels true and what feels factual, or what feels like what it was like in the room versus, like, what you can, like, manifestly describe about what was in the room. And I think that for me is always a tension, and actually is a good tension, will be a productive tension. I think for me, it is a good thing to be called back to having to ground with whatever feeling I'm trying to evoke or whatever idea I'm trying to evoke in a room, in bodies, in like, it's good to tether somehow to some pact I have with the truth or with an attempt at truth. Though that's a very messy prospect a lot of the time. And actually the messiness is something that I was thinking about while you were talking, Laura, and it's something I want to hear about. I hear you talk about too, Isabel. Like so much of the writing process is just a mess, and so much of what I think that is so interesting about your work, Laura, is the way that like you articulate and play inside the tension between the poet who needs and the writer, because you write all kinds of things, but like the writer who needs mess and works in mess and is I'm not as like the miasma you move in, and the doctor who is supposed to be not so messy, right? Is supposed to sort of like have their shit a little bit more cleaned up and together, though of course what they work on too, bodies, are quite messy. And so I'm just curious how you thought about like the place of mess in this work. And Isabel, I would also be really curious to hear you talk about where you feel like you want mess to live in your work, if at all.
Yeah, I think, as a doctor, the rope that you're clinging to is sort of like it extends backwards to like what really happened here, and it sort of extends forward into like, oh God, what's going to happen next? And you're kind of clinging right there, kind of in the present, and it's just one thing, but it's a crazy thing to cling to. It kind of feels like, the like harpoon that's in the whale, and now you're like clinging to the rope and surfing along, and it can feel sort of reckless or potentially endangering or scary as an experience, but nevertheless, it's kind of just one filament of continuous past to present to future in the sort of diagnostic and prognostic life of a patient or of a case. And so in some sense, it's very simple, even though there's a lot of emotion and velocity tied up in that. Whereas like the thing that you get to explore as a poet, which feels so liberating, is just the like 5 million strands of like not just what was, what is, what will be for the case or for the person, the patient, but what might have been, what could be, all these kind of like different subjunctive and kind of conditional moods, all these different alternate realities, all these different lives or personae or different theaters you can inhabit. And it's a much richer and messier experience, I guess, as an artist, to kind of have all these different dimensions in which to play. And I think for me, it feels like very bracing and kind of pleasing to then come back to the austerity of like the one line of the case when I move back into my clinical life. But I also feel so much more liberated or at play when I shift in the other direction. So yeah, I feel extremely lucky to have both, even though they're very different universes.
While we're talking, I keep thinking about how I have so much more license to lie than either of you. And my book is theoretically like about a family chronicle. It's thoroughly researched. I just started finding, because I've been moving, I just found a bunch of my old drafts and was looking at all the research that I did for this book when I was writing it, because it's a family chronicle. It goes back 3 generations, but yet the messiness of my work, I think, is just that I'm allowed to tell lies, and I have a complicated relationship with the truth as a rule. So I was thinking about so many of my poems started because I would just go have a conversation with my mother and be like, tell me some of these weird stories that happened. And one of the things I did when I actually started writing the book was substantiating whichever stories I could find with like research. So I read through an archive of newspapers from that area. And what I found was so many of the stories I was told, they might be true, but one of the stories, and it's this poem called Oddfellows Cross, is about supposedly my cousin Wayne Peake escaped from prison and then just hid out in this tiny little hole in Dykesburg, which is a Kentucky has a population of like 26. Anyway, for my mom said forever and was never re-caught. And I looked everywhere to substantiate the story, and then realized it, like, there are no history of prison breaks in Kentucky that are consistent with the story I heard. And then I was like, oh, this is dumb. Why am I, like, so much of my work is inspired already by Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the idea that orature is a version of epistemology that can somehow live simultaneously in, I don't even want to say cognitive dissonance, but in this kind of mystic counterpoint with the epistemologies of the Enlightenment, with of facts, of logic, of deduction, of induction, and reason. And so I ended up writing a poem that was exaggerated to the point of being beyond the capacity to tell the truth. But that counterpoint, I realized, was like exactly what I want the book to be. I wanted it to be this fertile space between what is physically real, what is substantial, what can be observed, and that's how we create the logic of say medicine, and that which is observable only in a kind of fleeting or affective way and can be captured only in language, which is this sort of affective or mystic space. And I remember that you both have a whole lot of mysticism in your books. I don't mean to be a mystic today. I'm really not, as a rule, but like, you have a line. I mean, that was one of the things I noticed, Laura, and also Jordan, when I was looking, as Laura, you have a line that, like, this was not a church. You know, my friends were not here. But if we're talking about institutions of medicine, you have the institution of medicine, but also that of church, which has ritual language. And Jordan, you talk about both this idea that everyone is God and no one is God, like everyone is embodied in the presence and experience of being God, and say, like, gravity of somethingness is what you associate with God, this kind of galvanizing force, or oh no. Anyway, so I was wondering, like, where does that sort of emulsion of the real and the insubstantial fit? Like, why does the sacred keep creeping into these texts about the embodied experience of living?
That's such a great question. And let me just also flag that, one, I want to go back to your poem, Oddfellows Cross, and I wonder if maybe you could read it in a little bit so that we get a taste of the kind of braided narratives and anecdotes that run through your work, and the sort of lies or myths or, you know, stretches of the fabric of reality that you perform, because I love that poem, and I had actually wanted to ask you to read it at some point, because I think in your work you make the pact with the reader very explicit that we are in a theater, because, you know, you have so many persona poems. There are so many different first person pronouns that wouldn't really, you know, align under kind of the same psychological heading of the same person. So we understand that we're moving among a cast of characters. And I think that's a really cool thing. So yeah, if you could come back to that in a minute, that would be really fun to hear that read by you. The spiritual or the sacred in this work or in the practice of medicine, I mean, I think a lot of it comes to us via tradition. I know, Jordan, you write about how our very language of obsession came from kind of theological understandings of how demons would enter the body. So maybe you want to pick up that baton from there, and you could either read that passage if you want, or you could just maybe explain to us how that how those languages are are joined at the root in the way that we talk about mental illness and the way that we talk about the spirit in a more sacred sense.
Yeah. I think when Isabel, when you were asking this question, I was thinking like, well, I think the reason why like science and the body and also like mysticism or spirituality or God keep showing up in the same place in my essays is because like I am not a religious person anymore, but I think the body is like the wildest possible miracle. And maybe it's just because I'm not a doctor and I don't understand it, but I've also met doctors who feel like, oh my, this is so far beyond anyone's comprehension. And there it is like this, I mean, we inhabit these things that we could never possibly understand, and even, or that we could never know. Laura, you have that beautiful line in your poem of like, what's this sort of serialized poem about Cadaver 28 of like this body that I know better than I will ever know my body, right? Like that we like inhabit these, the word I always want to use is magical. We have these like magical things that we can't understand. And that to me is always about a confrontation, both with sort of immanence and with science, because science is one of the languages we have to sort of like approach understanding. Laura, the passage that you mentioned, it's true. Like I won't read this section about like the church and the vocabulary because it's like long and sort of technical and historical, but you are right that where it's in this OCD essay, and I was looking at the history of like, where do these ideas come from? That, you know, that some doctor then told me in whatever 2003, and I realized that a lot of the language we have comes from obsession versus possession, which is all about these metaphors of a castle and where the invader is in relation to the castle and blah blah blah, and like that so much of the way that we understand or categorize different forms of illness, and maybe particularly mental illness, have to do with the stories that we're telling culturally about what's happening in the body metaphorically. But I will read a couple paragraphs from another thing that you mentioned. One thing that distinguishes obsessive compulsive patients from people with schizophrenia is their experience of this particular paradox. The thoughts hijacking their minds feel urgently not theirs, but are nevertheless innate to their own minds and bodies. These thoughts feel alien, but not externally imposed. In the medical community, this is known as insight. Having insight is not enough to make the thoughts go away. A little while ago, I was talking to a writer who has to touch things, all the banister posts on the staircase, all the poles as he walks down the street. He knows this doesn't make sense. Sometimes, though not terribly often, he has to go back home to confirm that he didn't leave a burning cigarette, even when he can remember perfectly well that he didn't. He has to do this only when alone. When he's with people, he doesn't have to touch anything. He told me that since childhood, he's been fascinated with the idea that everyone is God. I asked him what he meant, and he said that he had a suspicion that God was everywhere, and everyone and all our souls are the same soul, God's soul, but we're just walking around in different meat suits. That's how he said it. We're all stuck in our own meat suits. I suddenly felt very aware of how different he and I look. His height and beard and age, his ruddiness, his tie, my stringy arms, bitten nails, and freckles. He's older than I am, and bigger, and embodied in a sort of a ragged, robust way that I am not. At first, I couldn't quite tell whether he was fucking with me when he leaned in and looked into my brown eyes with his blue ones and said, "What I'm saying is that maybe we're all the same, we just don't know it because we're separated into our own bodies." But then I decided that he was not fucking with me and was serious, at least partly, about this hypothetical. And part of me was thinking, get a grip. And another part was thinking, well, exactly. Which did not signal that I was on board with the meat suit theory per se, only that I was not surprised, even a little, to discover another person with OCD who'd been worrying his whole life about the distinctions and correspondences between himself and other people, and between himself and God. You don't have to have OCD or any mental illness to have concerns like this. but the urgency of locating the boundaries of the self, the distinction between what is inside and outside you and not you, becomes particularly acute when your mind seems a little too permeable. I'll stop there. So like, I think though that the themes there of like self versus other, self versus God, inside versus outside, and permeability, this question of like whether there is a border or a boundary of the self, feels like so present in Little Pharma in a way. There's so much of the voice of the poem kind of looking at bodies or looking at other people and trying to kind of like negotiate where one stops and the other starts. And like Isabel is somebody who writes so much about like not just the truth and lies and in like negotiating the boundaries between those, but about the truth and the lies as they are told between people and as they are collectively shared. I'm curious to know like how that manifests in your work, how you think about that.
Well, one thing I keep thinking about when I was listening to you talk, Jordan, was the way you use pronouns is really interesting, because you're using a first person I know in prose it's like slightly less of an intensely curated thing. I mean, it is, but without the personas necessarily. And yet, so you're talking in the first person about encounters with this man with OCD who is concerned about the miscibility or immiscibility of bodies and souls with one another. And then you kind of slip into a second person, like right at the end of that passage where you're like, well, when you do this, you do that. And, you know, the second person is a fascinating choice because are you addressing the reader all of a sudden? Are you addressing someone who has been born yet, or someone who has not, someone who has found your work yet, or someone who hasn't? And I keep thinking the second person, it has this room because it is this very vague proxy of a thing to both slip into each other's bodies and experiences and empathic voices, and then also slip back out of them. I'm not you, but I also can try on you as a pronoun. And that just reminded me of, among other things, like Laura, you have this really interesting sub theme where you both have a poem that's about the self as a republic, and then also you have another, like all these moments in I think it's Cadaver 28, but you end up talking a lot about the nature of like governance as something that one does over the body, and this, like, I mean, it's an e pluribus unum problem of like particularity versus singularity versus the enormity of the thing. And I just was wondering like how you negotiate that. I mean, one of the things I've been wanting to ask you is, you wrote an essay about what it was like to be in a hospital during COVID, and I read it. It was extraordinary. It was very moving, and I wanted to ask. I mean, that isn't fully immediately present. I wouldn't call this a COVID book, but on the other hand, there is this moment where you're constantly asking, for example, in looking at Cadaver 28, about the degree to which one person can stand in for another, the degree to which you can know a person without knowing them ever, and the degree to which, you know, the enormity of seeing body after body after death, it's there in Puck and the oncology ward as well, is like, how do you think poetry works as a sort of healing process? How does it work for negotiating that space, especially given the enormity of watching so many people die at once? I mean, we can hardly process it except as numbers. For my own sanity, I remember just comparing it to the numbers of losses during different American wars, and then it exceeded all of them. And so I no longer had a metric by which to think about what we've lost in the last 2 years. And I just was wondering how that works for you. I mean, you have so much immediate experience with it, Laura.
Yeah, again, there's so much to unpack there, but to choose a couple of strands, I think one of the things that the book is wrestling with is the worry that empathy is potentially an intrusion or an imposition, or is an arrogance, because sort of feeling your way into someone else, you might not have been invited there, and you might kind of go in via the wrong portal, and you might not be welcome when you arrive. And so there is a kind of massive arrogance to the project of sort of imagining your way towards someone, or imagining your way towards a collective or a community, that I think is studded with all kinds of hazards on a technical level, in terms of like the sort of plausibility or felt kind of authenticity of the poem, but then, you know, just as a citizen, as a moral being too. So I think it's a difficult technical challenge, and one that will probably take me an entire career to pick my way through. But yeah, I think getting back to your point about loss and about mass death, I'm not sure that I have a way to process that either. Process, you know, what's happened to our country, to the planet. I think I cling to the particular, because that's my own way of maintaining sanity, is to, you know, look at one corpse at a time, one bed at a time, one loss at a time, and that is what I can do. I think that there are really amazing poets of like mass elegy. Like I think like Muriel Rukeyser's Book of the Dead, for example, is just like an incredible document of just sort of mass manslaughter because of what happens in the mining industry, or what did happen kind of in the mid 20th century. And I think there are other poets too who are great at the macro. I think that's not yet part of my toolkit, although it's something I'm deeply interested in. Yeah, so I'll leave that there. There's a lot else to say. I wonder if we should look at our chat box for a second. What do you guys think?
I just looked and I don't see any, or wait, I don't see any questions.
Oh, okay, great. Well, then let's keep going. I saw a bunch, but I think it's all about her books. Great. Jordan, do you want to, excuse me, Isabel, do you want to take a second to read a poem for us? Maybe either one of the Personae poems, or Oddfellows Cross, or whatever you think would be a good way to tie a ribbon on some of the ideas you brought up about your own work.
Yeah, I'll read Oddfellows Cross, but the reason is obviously that, it would be that this poem does have that weird blurring of boundaries between one person and another, because it's me telling a story that belongs to my mother, which belonged to her mother. I don't know when the story supposedly happened. I think it was in the 50s. But again, it lacked specificity, because I think it's not entirely true. But the story is, of course, that my cousin escaped the penitentiary, and I decided to embroider it as a kind of elaborate form of orature in order to blend together these different moments of cyclical historical trauma. Okay, so Oddfellows Cross. And I haven't mentioned, I tend to read these in dialect, so forgive my accent, which is not entirely authentic either. Old Wayne Peak escaped the penitentiary, had his mother sneak him in a seed of sunflower hid inside a Johnny cake. He watered it beside the lowest prison fence for 60 days until it was growed so tall for him to climb it by its leaf. And when he come up to the top, its face spit shine like August. Wayne untucked a sheet he'd stripped from off a cot and caught himself a breeze, his legs full dangling please his cuss. And when he got back home, his sister give him her old dress beside a bowl of green persimmons, so our Wayne become a girl and eyes blue as indigo. And the brown he'd had before, and looking like calamity, he wait for all the guards to come a rattling at the door. The meanest one, he asked Wayne for a glass of buttermilk to freshen his porch, and winked the look of skeletons half buried. So poor Wayne just smiled, his face a blossom of sweet Sicily, and spit a quiet hawk into his glass. Till things got quiet, Wayne gone back to Wayne, and no one from the prison found him, hid out deep in Dacusburg among the man-sized catfish in the river, and the owls the shape of sow-bugs children keep for toys and matchboxes. On days there's rain and no one free to tell what's true. Dacusburg, Kentucky.
That was phenomenal. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Well, let's see.
We have one question from Ross. Laura, how many poems in the collection, if any, did you write after the start of the pandemic? Did your time in the hospital at the height of the COVID outbreak lead you to make any revisions on previously written poems?
Oh, thanks, Ross. That's a really great question. As it happens, the sort of embarrassing truth is that all but, I believe, 1 to 2 of these poems were written pre-COVID, although I was very much revising during the pandemic. And the one that I can clearly remember writing kind of intra-pandemic was is called Little Pharma's Course on Sonography, and it's about trying to learn to wield an ultrasound machine in order to discover what's inside the body and to make something of these kind of hazy, shadowy pictures that one sees, which I think was very much kind of a coping mechanism for me. Like, let's really clamp down on the technical, let's really clamp down on just the visual domain and kind of like mute the whole rest of the sensorium, because there's just a sort of too muchness to what is happening right now. And so I think on a formal technical level, I hadn't yet, and I don't think I have yet, figured out quite, a language, addiction, a style appropriate to the pandemic in terms of poetry. So that is something that maybe I'll be able to do in the future. But it's very hard when you're still very much afloat in it.
We have another question in the chat. So Nicholas asks, what has someone told or asked you about your work that gave you a new angle on it? And it's for everyone.
Yeah, that's also very good. I think I have there's a suite of poems, particularly in the back half of the book, that are now all called the Imagining Marriage poems, or they have Imagining Marriage in the title. And I didn't quite realize what I was doing when I was writing the first few of them, until a mentor pointed out to me that I was really wrestling with the question of, whether it would be okay or whether it would be sort of prohibitively scary, or again, kind of too much to think about sort of letting go of the individual self as kind of the primary atomic unit kind of out there in the world, socially and civically and romantically and everything else. And to think about, sort of fusion with another person or sort of dissolution of the self into something bigger than oneself. And so once I was told that that was kind of the philosophical thing I was wrestling with, that kind of cracked open a whole new spate of poems and really helped me to think about, what other kind of light and shadow can I put on that problem, the problem of sort of oneness versus two-ness, or oneness versus manyness, which kind of gets back to, I realized that also sort of linked back to the cadaver and dissection poems. And then I realized that the poems were talking to each other. And I felt secure in the fact that there was a problem there that was big enough to warrant a book. So that was very helpful. Does one of you want to take a stab? I think we have like a minute left.
Isabel, do you have one?
You know, the main thing that, well, I was wondering, Laura, was it Jory who's the mentor you're talking about, Jory Graham? Or was it someone else?
It was,
anyway,
actually, it was back in Charlottesville, but yeah, carry on.
So it's not really something that was observed about my works. Well, someone did call my reading work a bar fight that just never stops. And I remember thinking, well, that is way more accurate than they realize. But I think the thing that Jory often gave, so I was in workshop with Laura with Jory Graham, and Jory used to say that there's like a current in the wire of a poem, and when you can find the current, that's like where you should write from and through. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, I mean, that's like an almost spiritual way of talking, right? But I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it meant. And I think to some extent, when there's a current in the wire, you are creating the intimate in a public way and the political in a private way. That somehow there's a sort of confluence of the sort of stakes of poetry, which I was almost about to ask, like, what is the difference between the stakes of medicine and the stakes of poetry? Which, like, for us, we're asking questions about immortality that aren't necessarily life or death in the same way. But anyway, so I remember thinking the quickness of a poem is determined entirely by its relationship to history and the intimate experience of feeling emotion in the body. Jordan?
I think we have like 10 seconds left. I was asking I was interviewing someone for a piece the other day, and I tend to end conversations like that by asking, what have I not asked you that you feel that I should have asked you? What have I not given you an opportunity to say? And for the first time ever, she turned this lovely woman turned the question around and just said, what do you not yet understand? And I was so like amazed and sort of taken aback by that question, but it was so the right response in a way. And it's something that I want to, this was like 2 days ago. It's something I want to carry forward in my work of thinking about when I'm not just as a starting point for any piece of writing, what do I not yet understand? What do I want to understand at the end of writing, but also at the end of a piece of writing or of a conversation or of an exchange, thinking, okay, what do I not yet understand, as a way of gesturing forward or into the, into the ether where all things eventually go.
That seems like the perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Jordan and Isabel. Yeah, and thanks to all the friends and colleagues and everyone who came out tonight.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, thank you all so much, Laura, Isabel, Jordan. This was such a great discussion. Thanks to everybody for joining us. Please don't forget to buy your copy of Little Pharma in store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks.
Bye.